In the last video, we looked at graphing quadratics for your homework by making a table of values. So we'd made a table of values like this over here. Here's our table of values. And then we used those points from the table of values to graph some parabolas, which we got over here. The second part of your homework asks you to find the vertex and the axis of symmetry, which is another way to put the graph of a quadratic, to put a graph of a parabola onto a grid without having to plot quite so many points from a table. So let's take a look at that. Let me zoom in here a little bit so we can see the problems. So this is referring to problem number 25 and problem number 27. And the instructions say to graph the function, to label the vertex and the axis of symmetry. So we're going to start with actually finding the axis of symmetry and the vertex, and then we'll put them on the graph. You need two formulas for this. One formula is going to be the equation that they're giving you. So it'll be y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And the other formula that you're going to need is the one for the axis of symmetry, which is x equals the opposite of b over 2a. First step is going to be to figure out what a, b, and c are. And then the second step will be to plug those values into this formula over here and figure out what the axis of symmetry is. Then we'll use the results of that to find the vertex, put it on a graph, and you'll see it goes really kind of quickly after that. So let's start off with number 25. And number 25 says to graph g of x. And don't get all worried about g of x. G of x is just another way of indicating that you're looking at your output. So some people just think of it as y, but we're going to call it g of x in this case. G of x equals negative x squared minus 2x minus 1. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to figure out what my a, b, and c values are. And I do that just by reading them right off of the equation. So the value for a is going to be the coefficient of x squared. So what number are we multiplying x squared by? And I think it's an invisible 1, and it's not writing red here. So it makes it a little hard to see. Let's try that again. There we go. So there's that invisible 1. So a is a negative 1. B is going to be whatever number you're multiplying x by, the x coefficient, not the x squared, but the x coefficient, and that's going to be negative 2. And then c is negative 1 again. So a and c happen to be the same here. So there's step 1. Figure out what a, b, and c are. Here's step 2. Plug them into the axis of symmetry formula. So we'll do that next. So now I'm going to find the axis of symmetry. And the axis of symmetry, you'll remember from class, is just a line that goes through the very middle of a parabola. So if here's my parabola like this, the axis of symmetry is a line that divides the parabola almost completely in half, well, exactly in half, and it crosses the parabola at the vertex. And we find the axis of symmetry by using x equals the opposite of b over 2a. So x equals the opposite of b, which is the opposite of negative 2, over 2 times the value of a, and a is negative 1. Now we'll clean this up a little bit. The opposite of negative 2 is just plain 2. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And 2 divided by negative 2 is negative 1. So my axis of symmetry is x equals negative 1. And that will be the first thing that we will graph. Now that we've got the axis of symmetry, we're also going to find the vertex, and we find the vertex by replacing our result, the answer we got from the axis of symmetry, back into the original formula. But let's remember first of all what a vertex is. So we're going to be looking for a vertex next. A vertex is going to be the point at the bottom or at the top of a parabola. It's your minimum or your maximum value. And because it's a point, we want two numbers. And in this case, we want a number for x, and we want a number for g of x. I already have the number for x. We found it in the last step, the axis of symmetry. That's going to be -1. What I need to find is the value for g of x. But that's going to be very easy to do. I'm just going to substitute -1 back into the original formula for my parabola. The g of x equals negative x squared minus 2x minus 1. So this is the problem they gave me. G of x equals negative x squared minus 2x minus 1. Make sure I wrote that down right. Yeah, I'm good. All right, so I'm substituting -1 in for x squared. The opposite of -1 squared. Don't forget to write down all those negatives. Minus 2 times -1 minus 1. Now let's clean this up a little bit. -1 squared is 1. The opposite of 1 is -1. -2 times -1 is a positive 2 minus 1. And it looks like all of that is turning into 0 at the end. So g of x equals 0. And here's my vertex, -1, 0. So now I have an axis of symmetry. I know where my vertex is. It might be helpful to know what my y-intercept is as well. So that'll be the last thing I'm going to look for. So step 4 is the y-intercept. And the y-intercept is going to be the point where this graph crosses the y-axis. So wherever the parabola is crossing the y-axis, that's going to be my y-intercept. So I know it's going to have a value of 0 for whatever my x is, and then some number for y. And what's very great about that is it's always going to be that constant term, that c. So let's go back and see what we found for c. A was -1, b was -2, and c was also -1. So I'm going to plug that in for my y-intercept. 0, -1. All right, let's go ahead and graph all of this. Let me zoom out so I can see all of this information at once. There's all that information. Put this on a grid. And let's make a graph. So here is a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. This is x. My vertical axis is g of x. I'm going to put a dotted line in for the axis of symmetry. Ooh, all this stuff popping up on the screen. And label that x equals -1. I'm going to graph my vertex, and my vertex is -1, 0. So -1, 0. There's my vertex. I'm going to graph my y-intercept. That's going to be 0, -1. And now I'm going to have a really easy time, I think, of finding the rest of the points. So, for example, I know there's another point on the other side of the axis of symmetry. And then maybe I'll just find one more. Maybe I'll find it at x equals 1. So if x equals 1, what is my g of x? G of x, -x squared minus 2x minus 1 is my equation. Substitute in positive 1 this time, so positive 1 squared minus 2 times a positive 1 minus 1. 1 squared is 1, that becomes a negative 1. 2 times 1 is 2 minus 1, so negative 1 minus 2 minus 1 is negative 4. So when x is negative 1, g of x is negative 4. Let's graph that point. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I can go exactly on the other side of my axis of symmetry and graph that second point. And then I can go ahead and sketch in my parabola. Ta-da! Beautiful, beautiful parabola. I have my axis of symmetry. Oh, I better label my vertex again. There's the vertex. And I'm done. So the other graph you're going to do in exactly the same way. If you have some questions on this, make sure you ask tomorrow in class.